Okay, well, if there's no objections, we'll call this meeting to order. This is a meeting of the Bloomington Common Council for Wednesday, June the 3rd. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Yes, Councilmember Rallo.
Here.
Scambalori.
She's out of the room.
No, she's
Here.
not.
Oh, no, she's there. Okay, good.
Rosenbarger.
Here.
Sims.
Here.
Boland.
Here.
Piedmont Smith.
Here.
Flaherty.
Here.
Smith.
Here.
Sandberg.
Here.
Thank you all.
We have a full house, and thank you for everyone for being here. Here is a summation of tonight's agenda. We will be approving minutes. We will hear reports from council members, the mayor and city offices, council committees, and the public. We will take up appointments to boards and commissions. We will hear legislation for second reading and resolutions, which include Ordinance 2010 to amend Title 15 of the Bloomington Municipal Code, BMC, entitled Vehicles and Traffic, regarding amending BMC chapters 15.48, removal and impoundment of vehicles, and 15.52, abandoned vehicles, to align rules for city-initiated tows with non-consensual tows. And Resolution 2008, approving the City of Bloomington's Transportation Demand Management Plan. We'll take up legislation for first reading and resolutions. We'll have a period for additional public comment on items not on tonight's agenda. We will take up matters of council schedule, and then we will adjourn. Let us start with approval of minutes. Is there anyone who has minutes to, Madam Parliamentarian?
I move approval of the minutes from August 7th, 2019.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? If not, all in favor? Well, we have to have a roll call vote on that. Madam Clerk?
Councilmember Rallo. Oh,
Councilmember Piedmont Smith, you had a question?
I just wondered if we could add the minutes of the special session on August 28th, 2019 and vote on those together.
I see no reason not to. We need a second. Though. All right. Is there any discussion on voting on both minutes at once? If not, will the clerk please call the roll on the motion?
yes, Councilmember Rallo.
Yes.
Scambalori.
Yes.
Rosenbarger.
Yes.
Sims.
Yes.
Boland.
Yes.
Piedmont Smith.
Yes.
Flaherty.
Yes.
Smith.
Yes.
Sandberg.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I will note that I'm noticing a bit of jitter in my own internet, so I will try to ask slowly and wait for responses. It looks like internet problems are the order of the day. We go now to reports from council members. I'll start with Councilmember Sims.
Thank you very much. The first thing I'd like to announce to the public and everyone that's listening, on Friday, June the 6th, there will be a peaceful protest march and rally. The title of that protest is Enough is Enough. And it will start at 3 p.m. in Dunn Meadow. There will be a peaceful march down 7th Street to the Courthouse Square. And there will be a brief rally with some with several community activist speakers. Please attend if you feel safe. Please understand that CDC and COVID guidelines will be followed. We ask that you wear a mask and practice social distancing, and mask and water will be provided. Friday, June the 5th, 3 p.m. at Dunn Meadow. We'll probably arrive at Courthouse Square around 4:10, 4:15 or so. So I wanted to make that announcement. Now my council comment this night, if I will. First thing I would like to do, and for everyone that's here and that's listening, I would like for you to take a deep, long breath. Now I'd like for you to imagine that George Floyd was not able to do so because a knee was on his throat and 2 more sets of knees were on his back. Now, can you imagine this? My Black skin is not a crime. Now, I've had allies across the city that inquire, reach out, and Jim, how are you doing? And other members throughout the town have done the same thing. I will share with you that I am in pain for this latest police-initiated action. I am angry and I am tired. Now, I would ask that you all, if you can, recall the Rodney King video almost 20 years ago. And if you remember, there was excessive police force, or what we consider that to be, by LAPD officers. And they all, of course, were acquitted in a court of law of using excessive force. I am tired because the climate in America hasn't changed much for Black and brown people over all of those years, and even further than that. Think of all the unarmed Black males that have been killed or otherwise injured by those sworn to protect and to serve. I am tired. A community activist friend of mine, I'll use her analogy, that even though you may not get murdered in the street or something, or very badly injured, what Black and brown people do with through a lifetime is what she describes as death by 1,000 cuts. What we mean by that? It's mostly race relations. It's how we treat each other. Do we treat them fairly? Do we treat them equitably? For example, someone who you relate with and they can't read you or understand you when all that is required is listening, cut. Someone calling the police on you knowing the response they'll get when they say, I'm dealing with a Black male, cut. Racial inequities and injustices in our courts and in our correction systems, cut and cut. Inequities and injustices in education, cut. Healthcare, cut. Employment, cut. Voting rights, cut. For the sake of brevity, I will not go further. I hope you get the message. Death by 1,000 cuts. I am tired, but I am encouraged. I am encouraged because there's a younger generation that we've been dealing with that are starting to stand up. They are more diverse, they're more socially and politically engaged, and they have a keen eye towards fairness. I am encouraged because we have many allies that are, although over the years have always been staunch supporters, they're willing to stand up with Black and brown people and ask, how can we help? I am encouraged because with this latest round of protests across our country, and for some of the reasons that they're protesting, it feels like real change could possibly happen this time. It was one of the reasons for my tiredness. You do a lot of work and you don't see a lot of progress. It feels like change could happen now. I would also lastly like to say that all these social ills, the police brutality, all these injustices, all of the inequities, these are social ills that are directed toward our minority population. And I want to remind you, they're just symptoms of the greater disease. And that disease is ingrained, institutionalized racist practices. And this disease must be dismantled for us to make progress. I'm looking so much forward to see what we can do at the grassroots level, at the city level, at the community level, at Bloomington, and as we move beyond. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilmember Sims. Councilmember Escambaluri.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this. And my colleague, Councilmember Sims, thank you for those powerful words. One of the greatest struggles as I watch some of the social media and as I watch some of the discussion focuses on what we can do if we're not marching. What can we do if we are appalled and angry, but are not marching? What else can we do? And I want to point to a very powerful article that I noticed called 75 Things White People Can Do. And I will actually post it in the chat in a reference to it. But I would point to it as an example of all the tools we do have in our toolkit, even when we feel frustrated and even when we feel powerless. There are still things we can do there. We can support the Southern Poverty Law Center. We can go out of our way to encourage our children to develop the skills needed to function in a diverse society and to thrive there. And I think one of the questions I've heard people struggle with most is, what can I do? I will place that in the chat, and then if it could be reflected in the minutes as well, I would appreciate that. But Councilmember Sims, I am grateful for your words, and I am still grateful that I live in the city of Bloomington. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Scambolari. Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Councilmember Sims, for that eloquent reflection on what we're going through, well, what your community is going through. I can't include myself there. First of all, a couple disclaimers. I'm not blaming the Bloomington Police Department for anything. I'm not, and I'm speaking as a white person, obviously. But I have a few things to get off my chest. First of all, what happened? So yet another murder of an African-American individual at the hands of police that are the unit of society that are supposed to protect us. People talk about a violation of social contract. It's fine to protest peacefully, but as soon as you start throwing things in windows, you know, that's over the line. You can't do that. Well, who broke that social contract? The police did. They are the ones we trust to enforce the laws that supposedly we all agree on in a democratic society. And they have repeatedly violated that social contract with almost zero repercussions for any of them. So don't talk to me about why are they looting? Why are people throwing things? Because they've had it up to here. Trevor Noah said, police in America are looting Black bodies. So don't complain about looting, because the African-American community has suffered their own source of looting for 400 years. Secondly, the response from our leaders has been shameful, inadequate, and inciting even more pain and violence. President Trump, in his tweet, said, you know, you start looting, we start shooting. He was quoting a racist white leader from the 60s. I mean, we need somebody to bring people together to try to soothe this monstrous wound, which keeps getting bigger. And Trump is not up to the task. Trump is not up to almost any task we expect from a president. But then to stage a photo op by, first of all, using forceful means to remove people from in front of the church in Washington, D.C., and then pose for a photo op with a freaking Bible that he probably has never opened in his life. It's just outrageous. It's just it's what former CIA agents have said they see in totalitarian governments in other countries all the time. And then there's Trey Hollingsworth, our congressman. What did he send out today as his weekly constituent poll. The title was Censorship. And his polls are always pointed questions there. He doesn't really care what people actually think. And his poll was about Twitter putting a warning label on Trump's tweet. With the agony our country is going through and the systemic racism that has been brought to the surface again and again and is exploding. And what does he communicate to his constituents about? So-called censorship. It's outrageous, and it makes me angry and it makes me sad as an American. So moving on to the problem. The problem of systemic racism in this case, and of course it permeates our society in many, many ways. But first of all, the police kind of police themselves. They have internal affairs bureaus and they say, oh, there's a problem, we'll look into it. That's no way to control anybody. I mean, nobody should be policing themselves. Then they have civil service protections. So the union chief of the union representative who heads the police union in Minneapolis has already said he's going to appeal the firing of those 4 officers. He thinks they should be reinstated. In Minneapolis, there's a 46% reinstatement rate after police officers are fired. So it's incredibly hard to fire police officers and make it stick. That needs to change. We do have civilian review boards, and we have one here in the city of Bloomington. In most communities, they have no teeth. They can make recommendations, but those recommendations don't have to be followed. That's something we need to change. Police unions, I'm all for unions. I think workers do need to be protected. But some of these police unions protect really bad apples and protect a system in which racism flares into violence at the hands of police. And that cannot be tolerated. And finally, in court cases, police can always argue that they had a reasonable fear for their life. That is such a hazy notion that it's almost impossible to convict a police officer. That has got to change. We need to pursue these systemic changes. And here in Bloomington, we need to start by checking our state of Indiana and our local codes and procedures and laws, and make sure that we do have accountability for police. And that is something that I pledge to do. And I've already sent an email to our corporation council to start that process. I've been in tears, I've been yelling, I'm fed up, and I'm not African American. I can't even pretend to understand how fed up brown and black people in our country are. And it's an outrage. That's all I have.
Thank you. Let me point out that normally we set aside 20 minutes for each set of reports. We're already 15 minutes into council member reports. I want to accommodate everyone who wants to speak at this time because it's an important issue, but I would just ask everyone to be conscious of their time. Councilmember Sandberg.
Thank you. And I will be brief. The strong and passionate words of our colleague, Councilmember Sims, stand alone. I just stand in empathy and solidarity with him and to all in this community everywhere who have experienced those cuts. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Rollo.
Thank you. Very good comments. I would just add that my support is with the protesters over the past days. Just pulling back, I think we're in a variety of institutional crises. And I think, as Councilmember Sims said, referred to that with hope that we might have real change this time. And I share that hope. I think the institutions that are in crises are not just police departments throughout the country, but are systems of government, social institutions, economic institutions. And I noted this week that even as riots were protests and then riots evolved, the stock market went up. And it couldn't help but go up because the Federal Reserve has been printing money, which finds its way into the financial system. So this has resulted in a very curious thing, which is, I noted this week, there was an article, I think in Forbes, that said that the billionaires of the country during this pandemic crisis and now this social crisis have increased their wealth by $450 billion. And I read a similar, I've read another headline in a different newspaper that said that 9 million families throughout the country have trouble buying food because they're unemployed. So clearly this speaks to a real, very deep crisis in our country. And it's time for a reset. And I hope that we make that reset soon. We have an election coming up in the fall, and I'm hoping we take a major step toward a reset for equality and fairness in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Council Member Flaherty.
Yes, thank you to my colleagues for very thoughtful comments and words so far. First, I actually have an update by way of the MPO Policy Committee. I wanted to share with viewers and as well as council colleagues an opportunity for public engagement in the development of the new 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan. For those who are unfamiliar, the Bloomington Monroe County Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO for short, provides transportation planning services for Bloomington, Ellettsville, and parts of Monroe County. And part of these services include the development of long-range plans to guide our transportation projects within the MPO boundaries. So our current plan extends through 2040, and this update will extend that time horizon to 2045. I'll drop a direct link to the survey in the chat, but also to access the survey, you can go to bloomington.in.gov/MPO, and then just click on the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. The survey link is on that page, along with some more information about the planning process, draft chapters to date. It's completely anonymous, takes 5 or 10 minutes to complete, and as much outreach as we could get with constituents and anyone in the community to fill that out and help us guide our priorities in the transportation system would be great. So thanks so much. And then additionally, along with my colleagues, I want to say that I stand in solidarity with the Black community and that I want to express my grief and anger at the murder of George Floyd and call for justice. And of course, as others have noted, George's death is just one in a tragically long list of Black and brown bodies that have been taken from us by state-sanctioned violence. We have to change and we have to do better. We need to continue to work to address police violence, bias, and militarization, the scourge of mass incarceration, driven by racial inequities in law enforcement and sentencing practices, as well as all manifestations of systemic racism. I pledge to do more to educate myself and to listen and learn from Black, brown, and Indigenous voices in our community. And I think we on the Bloomington Common Council need to redouble our efforts to change racist policies wherever we can, by which I mean any policy that produces or sustains racial inequity in our community. So I guess that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Smith.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank all my colleagues on the council for such eloquent statements. As a city council member, I thought it was really important to make a statement about the tragic events of the past week. I'm saddened that another Black person has been killed during a police action. Why does it continue to happen? I realize as a white person, I'm really never going to get it. But being Black in America shouldn't mean living with the fear that every interaction with law enforcement has the potential for a life or death situation. It's just unacceptable. I've been in social services my whole life. As a white male in this country, I'm painfully aware that people are treated differently because of the color of their skin. We all have biases because of our cultural backgrounds, how we were raised, our life experiences. but we can seek to understand our biases and learn to be better human beings. That is a way forward, and that's the way it needs to be. When Barack Obama was elected president, I thought we had turned a corner in race relations, and our country was moving into the 21st century in a more enlightened way, like, blooming of spring. But now it seems like it was an illusion. One step forward and 2 steps back. We are not blind. We all know that racism has also always been part of our country. Over the years, my friends and colleagues with brown skin have told me their experiences where racism has made them uncomfortable in Southern Indiana communities. When people watched them, when they drove into their communities, and when people were fearful for their lives during traffic stops, even while they were a soldier serving in the military forces in our community. They've told me about having that talk with their sons and daughters because they feared for their safety. This is just not right. Playing field is not equal. It's tilted against people of color, and it truly saddens me. We all have biases, so it's likely I'm never going to understand the experiences of my friends, no matter how much I try to comprehend it or how many Black friends or brown friends I have. But what I can do is remember every day how much the color of people's skin impacts their lives, determines where they live, the quality of their health care, which schools they can attend, how much they can earn. It determines access to opportunities and whether those lives matter. What I can do is look to recognize when the playing field is tilted and speak out against it. Former President Bush, who, I'm quoting him, which is definitely unusual, raised the question of how do we end the systemic racism in our society? And he said, the only way to see ourselves in a true light is to listen to the voices of so many who are hurting and grieving. So let's listen, let's try to understand, let's be better human beings. That is our way forward. It must be. We have a long way to go, so let's begin today. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Rosenberger.
Thank you. Thank you to my colleagues who have gone before me. I think everyone has said very thoughtful things here. This has really made me think about why I ran for council and what I experienced going door to door in this community as I was doing that, and even before that on the Liz campaign, going door to door. And one thing I said is that it was really clear that everyone doesn't feel included here, right? Everyone doesn't feel safe or welcome or supported in this community. And as a white person who has benefited and continues to benefit from the construct of race, I think it is up to me to do my part to bring awareness to the history of cultural and systemic racism in our country and in our state and even in our city. And I think it's up to me and all of us on council to take the steps to repair our systems so our laws and our policies and our practices no longer perpetuate racism. As I learn more and I continue to read, right, and have these conversations with people, I hope to evolve in this, and I hope to be a support to the Black community, and I hope the same for everyone in Bloomington. I had a constituent meeting last week, and we had a really good discussion, I think, amongst strangers about what structural racism looks like and how we contribute and what we can do to change it. And I think it's up to all of us to continue these conversations and have these hard conversations with our family, with our friends, with people we know, with people we don't know, and just really open up and be honest and talk about how we can change, how we can help, how we can make this place better and safer for the Black community. we passed the resolution a couple weeks ago as well, and I think that is a wonderful first step, as I said. And I think looking forward, what we can really do here to make a difference is continuing to vote 9-0 in places where we can change our policies so that we no longer have policies that perpetuate racism. Councilmember Sims talked about the June 5th protest, and I wanted to also post a link to the June 6th protest. It is a Facebook protest, so COVID safe, and I'll put that in the comments, but I want to make sure everyone has access to that as well in case you can't make the June 5th one or you want to go to both. You have those options. Thank you.
Thank you. My earpieces have gone out, so I hope that there's no echo. But I just want to thank my colleagues for their thoughtful remarks in this extraordinary time, this extraordinary year. I have been away from Bloomington for almost 3 months now, quarantined at my parents' house, 200 miles away, and I'll be coming back on Saturday. And I'm having trouble imagining what city I'm coming back to. I'm looking forward to seeing people again in person. We're going to be hearing a report from the mayor and other officials about the other crisis that we've been enduring this year that is much shorter in duration, no less intense. I appreciate the patience and the fortitude of everyone who is going through this time. My words are very poor. I want to thank everyone for their consideration. With that, we go now to reports from the mayor and city offices. Mayor Hamilton, I see you present. I hope that you can give us an update on the COVID-19 response and other matters of importance.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, okay. So first, thanks for all the comments and commitment and passion. And it's good to remember democracy matters and elections matter. And we just went through an election, so it's good to remind people how important that is. I'm glad we had that. I am going to talk about 2 viruses tonight. First, the virus that we've faced for 4 months with serious local challenges. I will continue to report that the latest data continue to be good with low hospitalizations, a low % of incidents in the testing that is being done. Less than 5% of those tested are testing positive. We have, as you all probably know, moved to stage 3 in effect in the state's protocols, with the exception that we have limited social gatherings to 50 persons or fewer. City Hall was open last week. We had really only about 10 or so visitors per day. For those 10, I know it mattered, but just to let you know, we've been able to do the vast majority of the work and continue to do so remotely, by phone, online. And our behaviors in this community will continue to drive our future activities. That's why masks, distancing, all those protocols are so important. The 2 work groups that you often hear from are underway, active. They're transitioning to longer term effects. You'll hear from both of them at the next council meeting, but not tonight, though I'm happy to answer questions about anything they're doing. And I have to join with you all to talk about this second virus for a minute or two. This virus that for 400 years has been in America, a social virus of racism and bigotry. It is a virus that is spread person to person, generation to generation. In the past several weeks, we've had horrific examples of police killings of innocent and unarmed people of color that have outraged our community and much of the country. It has poured salt in long-standing wounds. We have had several peaceful gatherings here to protest this ongoing painful injustice. People have marched. People have kneeled. People have written and spoken truth to power. People have cried and grieved, and people have been activated. Allies are standing up. Just this evening, I listened as President Obama expressed his grief in a town hall, and also his optimism for the future. His belief that our country, and I'd say our community, can indeed follow the lead of young people and improve our justice, make our union more perfect if we dig in and do the hard work. He also specifically tonight urged that every mayor in the country embrace the 21st Century Policing Report, review its components, and sign a pledge. I already signed it tonight again. As I hope you know, Bloomington went through in detail and embraced and implemented the full 21st Century Policing Report in 2016 with oversight from our Public Safety Board. With the pledge renewed, I will ask that board to review that report again over the coming months. I know our community feels the pain of racial justice especially hard today. I know all of us need to work together to make our community live up to our values, to reflect our values in the real world, on the ground, every day. We face a triple challenge: the continued insidious legacy of centuries of racism and white supremacy, layered with this global pandemic killing our neighbors, and a shattered, sputtering economy ravaging households all around us. We have to do the hard work of recovering forward, of making hard choices, of listening, really listening to each other to outline our future together, all together. I won't go on longer. There's more to be said, but more can say more at other times. I'll end my comments referencing that major rally that's planned in a march for this Friday, led by some of those optimistic young activists. It is right and good to rally and march. Bloomington is strong because we have strong activists and people of hope and dedication demanding a better tomorrow. As people gather at 3 p.m. in Dunn Meadow on Friday for that better tomorrow, I'll join Councilmember Sims in encouraging the masks and the physical distancing that will also protect our community from that 4-month virus as we move forward toward a more just community and country. I thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions if you have any.
Are there other reports from the mayor and city offices before we go to questions?
No, we're going to move those to the next meeting that you have. Thanks. Unless I'm mistaken, I think we're planning to go for it. I knew it would be long tonight.
That's fine. Are there any questions for the mayor from members? Seeing none, we'll go on now to.
You got one.
Councilmember Sims. Hello. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'd really just like to make a comment, if that's okay. I've had the pleasure, and I'm sure many of my colleagues have as well, and particularly in the last week or so with all of the community strife, or the strife we're dealing with across the country. And I've had the pleasure of discussing this to some degree with the mayor, and I'm looking forward to, again, what systemic type changes we can have an effect on locally that'll make this a better community and as we move forward. And I'm encouraged with some of the things that I'm hearing from the mayor's office. And these aren't a lot of new things, but I think they're just taking more importance from a social standpoint at this point. So I just wanted to say thank you, Mayor, for the statement that was made on behalf of the city in support of the Black and brown people in our community and justice and social equity, and look forward to what we can do as a community, as a local government body moving into the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We'll go now to, thank you, good night. We'll go to reports from council committees. Are there any reports from council committees on items not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll go to reports from the public. If there's any member of the public who would like to address the council on an item that's not on the agenda tonight, here's your opportunity, your first of two. I see at least one person already. Please use the raise hand function in Zoom or type into the chat. Mr. Lucas?
I think Mr. Randy Paul is up first. Just unmuted him and he should be ready to comment.
Mr. Paul, please go ahead. You'll have 5 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
I want to sound like I'm just repeating myself, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to talk again about continuing Zoom meetings once this pandemic is over. And the reason I keep bringing it up is I'm not getting any kind of commitment from anybody. And I'm not sure how the process is going to work for the city council. I'm not sure how you're going to make your decision. I would like to see it be done in public. I would love to see as city council members, come up with a resolution encouraging not just your meetings, but all city meetings and county meetings to be held by Zoom. And I feel strongly about this. I always talk about, I'm representing the interests of people with disabilities, but it also falls for the general public. I think it has been shown over time that people are coming into these meetings. I think if you look at your numbers, it's going to show you've got public interest. I went back to the 2010 census, and roughly, if I remember the numbers right, it showed a population in the city of roughly 85,000 people, with 8% of that being people having disabilities. So you're looking at roughly 6,800, 7,000 people in the city that say they have a disability. So I think you're looking at a large number of people as far as their access to government business. I've been doing some studying of the ADA recently, particularly the most recent 2018 updates, where it talks about government access. And while it doesn't say, city government should have Zoom meetings, there's a lot of emphasis on access. And access now is viewed more than just a building, concrete and mortar. Are your doorways wide enough? It focuses much more on the public access. Do you have access to government services and government functions? And I think, I certainly think I could make the argument that says if someone can't get to the meeting only by remote, by Zoom, that can fall under the ADA, that can fall under access. And I think it's something that we ought to talk about. But I hope that when you make this decision, whether you continue this or not, that it be done in public. I think I see the city as being a leader in this. I think if the city would make a decision to continue this, that others would fall in line. The only group right now that's made a firm commitment is the CCA, which is the Council for Community Access, and you would expect them to support this. That's their job. But I think this is an important issue, and I hope that when you make your decision, you do it in public, and that you consider the accessibility of city government to people with disabilities. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak on an item not on the agenda? Mr. Lucas?
Next up, we have Mr. Greg Alexander, who should be ready to comment.
Mr. Alexander, you'll have 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Greg Alexander. I can already hear, some of you guys are surely thinking, that I'm going to use social justice as an excuse to talk about transportation. And I hope you're aware that actually I all along have been kind of doing that backwards. I've been using sidewalks as an excuse to talk about social form. You know, that's kind of weird. I grew up in the suburbs as a middle-class white kid, and I hated the segregation. You know, I hated the social form was what really upset me the most about it. And that you know that's petty. You know, I'm super privileged. When I grew up, I was able to live in the neighborhood of my choice. You know, I didn't have any barriers, and now my kids go to Fairview. You know, I got what I wanted. But everything I hated about that segregated neighborhood that I grew up in was enabled by the car, and it was defined by the car. I don't hate the car so much. I hate the community, the neighborhood that the car built. And so I'm just going to list a few ways that transportation influences segregation that continues in this nation. We obviously have segregated neighborhoods. We got cul-de-sacs where you can't drive through the neighborhood because people don't want to have strangers driving through their neighborhood. And if you're wealthy enough or fortunate enough to be able to have that kind of amenity, you can segregate yourself from, you know, just your neighbors. We've got, you know, we have, everybody already knows this phrase, driving while black. You know, if black people go into the wrong neighborhood, obviously they're going to face trouble. But we see that it happens thanks to the investigations after the Ferguson situation some years ago, where another young man was killed by police. We know that if you drive while black in the right neighborhood, in the black neighborhood, you also face police will just do random stops and they'll charge everybody in the black neighborhood with speeding, whether they were speeding or not. You know, the fact that transportation is inextricably linked to policing. You know, police spend about a third of their time on transportation, on cars, on, you know, broken down cars and wrecks, but also on enforcement, which is a major source of disparity. You know, car stops, when people talk about disparity in places where there aren't so many cars, the police disproportionately approach people who use the subway, and obviously mostly black people. We see this in the protests in Ferguson, and now today the protesters block the freeway because they live in a neighborhood that was bypassed by the freeway, so that white people and white dollars could just flow right through their neighborhood without even stopping. And so the only way that they can get the attention of the population that makes all their decisions is by blocking the freeway. We see in Charlottesville, a young woman was killed, 3 years ago, by somebody drove into a crowd. In New York City and Portland, we have seen videos now of cops driving directly into crowds again. You know, sometimes the crowd is able to disperse and sometimes it isn't. We've seen that in Minneapolis, a semi-truck driver drove into a crowd. He was immediately, the governor apologized, said, oh, he didn't mean anything by it, he's not racist. You know, we accept this basic level of vehicular violence, and we make excuses for the drivers before we even find out what the story is. And we've had it here.
1 minute.
We've had protests here that have had drivers drive into them. 2 nights ago, a driver drove into a protest. And it's amazing how dehumanizing the car is. I differ actually with Councilmember Sims. I am not optimistic about youth actually changing things if they're going to live in this same built environment where segregation and alienation and dehumanization is just absolutely taken for granted. They will grow up, they will move into the suburbs, and they will adopt the same suburban attitudes as everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. Are there any other members of the public who would like to speak? Please raise your hand in Zoom or type into the chat, and Mr. Lucas will recognize you. We'll hold the door for a few more seconds. Mr. Lucas, is there anyone else who would like to speak?
That I see.
Okay. Having said that, thank you, everyone. We will move on now to appointments to boards and commissions. Are there any appointments to boards and commissions? Or are there, appointments of any kind?
Yes, Mr. President. I move that the council hire Stephen Lucas, who is currently serving as Deputy Administrator Attorney of the Council, to be the Administrator Attorney of the Council effective no earlier than August 1st, 2020.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Councilmember Sims and I were tasked with discussing the position with Mr. Lucas. We believe we've come to an understanding and that he will accept the position if it is offered to him. And so I'm happy to endorse this this motion. I think he will be a great replacement for Dan Sherman, who has served us for 30 years. And I'm happy to answer questions. If Mr. Sims would like to comment, I would welcome his thoughts as well.
Actually, I'll wait until final
Okay.
comments if there's such a time. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any questions on the motion? Seeing none. If there's no comments, Councilmember Flaherty. He's muted.
My apologies. I had a cough earlier and decided to mute myself. I wanted to ask if either you, Councilmember Bolin or Councilmember Sims, could speak in a bit more detail about your deliberations and what is expected in terms of how if this motion were to pass, how the council would go about exploring appropriate salaries and other things like that.
We did discuss the salary range with Mr. Lucas. We feel like we found a number that is appropriate. I don't know, like we've talked about other aspects of employment, vacation time, understanding of how reporting would work. There were no, it was a very genial conversation. There were no disputes. I think we all felt comfortable with it. As far as, I don't know if I heard the entirety of your question.
I guess are those details already available that I somehow missed in a packet addendum or
no? And in fact, I'm afraid that I was neglected to send email today. I'm happy to postpone the question if it's I neglected to send an email out discussing the tenor of our discussions. So that's my bad.
I have a comment, I guess, but we're on questions.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
Well,
any other questions, Mr. Sims?
Well, I'd like to respond a little bit with that. First of all, and I think with the council president's meetings with every one of my colleagues, and I think it's pretty obvious that Mr. Lucas is eminently qualified to replace Dan Sherman. I understand my colleagues' questions, but the discussion, and I don't have notes with me. I thought our chair would do that, and that would be forthcoming. But we had an in-depth conversation. We did talk about salary ranges, that sort of thing. We talked about operations, and what I mean by that is there will be, it's very important on how our council attorney and administrator and their office works with the city clerks and her office, and some of those responsibilities. And maybe we'll see some changes as we do. And you all will be part of that conversation. It's not anything one or two people do. But we talked about those sorts of things. We talked about the hiring process for the assistant administrator and attorney as we move forward. I'm not so sure if that job has been posted just yet, but we've talked about a time schedule in order to do that. I will say this, I had conversations earlier once this all came out with other people in the community, and there was, one was stated that since we passed the condemning white supremacy resolution, and I was a sponsor, that somehow there was some sort of connection between those two. And I understand that from a public city standpoint. But as I said then, I think this was a matter of timing, first and foremost. Well, qualifications first, and then timing. We've got a person right in house that is ready, that knows how we operate, understands the council system, and that'll be a excellent and pretty easy transition. Now, when we talk about hiring an assistant, that will be much broader, much farther reaching. We will be talking about emphasis, again, not only on qualifications, but aspects of diversity to be part of what it is that we're doing and how we can help facilitate that. So that may not have answered everything, Council Flaherty, and I know when President Boland comes up with his, or does the notes, that there may be more detail. But if there's anything else more specific I or President Boland can answer, don't hesitate to ask.
Councilmember Rallo.
Yes, I wondered if I could propose that the council president postpone the vote on this appointment.
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Am I?
You were just
speak
a little
up?
bit louder.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was offering that perhaps you might consider postponing vote on this until relevant questions are given time to evolve and be answered, regarding compensation or duties or how this transition will occur, or so forth. I don't have any, but I want to make sure everybody here is comfortable. And if this isn't a problem, maybe we should postpone. Just suggesting.
I would be reluctant to, but I would have no objection to a postponement if the majority felt that was appropriate. Any other questions or comments or motions? Councilmember Flaherty.
Yeah, and point of order first, I guess. Are we commenting on? Was there an actual motion to postpone the vote? And is that what we're commenting on?
No, not yet.
No. Oh, it's just
no, there's
a
not yet.
Point. I guess I can frame my thoughts or comment in the form of a question to the committee or to Council President and Council Vice President, which is, I guess I feel more comfortable voting on something if I know the details of it, and I don't feel like I have adequate details at this moment, and that's why I would support postponing. But I guess I'm curious to know from your perspective what additional details. I'll reiterate my support for Mr. Lucas in the position, and also my trust in the two of you in negotiating and pursuing this. But I do feel like I need to know more details before taking a vote on the matter, and I would be curious to hear your plans in terms of what additionally might be shared and what that timeline could look like if the vote was postponed.
Well, I just want to apologize once again for neglecting to file a report with you all after our discussion with Mr. Lucas last week. That something I should have put in writing. But having not done that again, I don't blame anyone for wanting more details. Councilmember Sandberg.
Thank you. I just want to lend my support to the decision. I do have the confidence in the leadership team who bargained or went to the table and discussed this matter with Mr. Lucas. I can just say, as a long-term member of this council, and expressing my deep regard for Dan Sherman and the incredible work he has done on behalf of this council for 30 years. And I also want to say that prior to Mr. Lucas joining the team as the assistant, we suffered another great loss in the staff with the loss of Stacey Jane Rhodes, who also was a remarkable member of this team in terms of working collaboratively, cooperatively, with all due confidence, with all due competency. And it was truly exciting for me to see Mr. Lucas step into her role, because I was having a hard time thinking who was going to fill her big shoes. And he's done so with such great efficiency, I appreciated his work in the clerk's office as the deputy, and now that he is serving as the assistant to Dan Sherman, it makes complete sense to me that he has the opportunity to get the new post when that does become vacant with Mr. Sherman's retirement in August. So that issue, regardless of any details with the salary ranges, I'm sure that's been done equitably with the years of experience that he brings to the table, as well as his already serving in the office. And that continuity for me as a council person who depends on the work of our researchers and our legislative support team and our attorneys is just so crucial to us being a functioning council. His ability to cooperate and work well with the clerk's office, having come from that office, that is another big bonus. How the deputy is hired, that's another matter that will require more steps and more deliberations. This one to me is absolutely without question. And so I would have no problem voting for this tonight. I can understand if newer members of the council who maybe don't have the same history working with a smooth running team might have questions. I'm happy to defer, but I just want to express my complete confidence in this decision and confidence in the leadership team for having held the discussions appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Sandberg. Are there any other questions or comments or motions with respect to this motion? Councilmember Sims.
Oh, this is actually more of a comment on Councilmember Rallo's proposal, potential proposal. And I totally understand that. And I am willing to support that if we move toward that route. But the first thing I would like to entertain with my other colleagues, and I would note that Councilmember Rallo said, and he brought up a good point, but he said he didn't have any questions. If in fact there are any questions from any of our colleagues that can be addressed tonight, maybe that will alleviate the need to postpone this until later, even though I'm willing to do that if those aren't satisfactory. So I was just posing that as a possibility, if necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. Any other discussion on the motion? Councilmember Rallo.
This is a very important appointment, and I want to make sure everyone is comfortable with it. I understand that some are willing to make the appointment now and have as much information as they need. I'm not sure if we would have all the relevant questions this evening, and even if we did, if council leadership would be in a position to answer them at this point. So my appeal is to have the motion withdrawn and substitute a motion for to postpone until next regular session with the idea that we would then have adequate time for questions and answers to evolve and be answered.
I see Mr. Sherman raising his hand, but I might jump in just to say I think we don't need to have a motion withdrawn. We can just simply move to postpone to the next regular session. So if you'd like to make that, Mr. Sherman, would you like to confirm that?
One of the reasons for my retirement letter at the time it was given is that in event you wanted to elevate Stephen Lucas, you would have time to fill in the vacancy that would create. I would suggest if it's amenable, the person who makes the motion to postpone, make it for a special session next week, unless you believe there are questions, the questions aren't answerable within a week. I think a week at this point could make a difference. The hiring process could take you 6 weeks, and that puts you at the beginning of August. So thank you for listening.
Mr. Rallo, does that answer your question?
Well, I'm prepared to make a motion to postpone until next week's special session.
Before you do, if we can, I'm sorry. Before you do, if there are other questions that members want to ask Councilmember Piedmont Smith, I see her hand raised.
I think Councilmember Flaherty was first and then Councilmember Piedmont Smith, I think.
My screen is very jittery. Yes, Councilmember Flaherty.
It's okay.
It's okay.
I'll defer to Council members Piedmont Smith and Scambolari, I think, first, since I've already spoken on it. Thank you.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I wanted to ask whether this would be the only item that we would be needing to meet for on June 10th, because I do not see other first readings coming up. So I want to make sure we don't have a meeting only for this.
We have a resolution coming forward that will be referred to the Sustainable Development Committee. So there is a meeting scheduled next week, but we didn't have a special session scheduled. Although because we're still in the pandemic lockdown, we have had special sessions in order to hear reports, updates on reopening. So it's possible we might schedule one for that reason.
Well, normally it would be just a committee meeting evening. That's why I asked. But
Right.
if there are other reasons to call a special session, that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay. Final questions before we hear Mr. Rallo's motion? Councilmember Rallo?
Sue.
Councilmember Scambolari.
Councilmember Scambolari, I'm sorry, it's terrible.
Council members Volin and Sims, I appreciate the work you've done on this. This is a critical position. And I'm grateful that you've approached this in a thoughtful way. I don't have any further questions. I would be content to vote on this tonight, but I am entirely supportive of colleagues who might wish to wait a week and gather some additional information. I think that's fine. One of the things we've articulated so far is the need for the search for a successor, if indeed Stephen is elevated to this new position. The need for a very diligent search that ensures we have diversity in our candidate pool, and that we reach as many different qualified candidates as we can. That takes time. So I would encourage us not to put this off more than a week. We are already kind of clipping along in June, and searches take a while. So I would encourage us, if we choose to delay, just to move forward as quickly as possible, ideally in a week, but no more than 2 weeks if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Scambolari. I can't see 3 people on screen. Councilmember Rallo.
Well, I would move that we postpone the appointment of Stephen Lucas to the position of Council Attorney Administrator until June 10th.
Second.
A special session. We have a motion in a second.
Session.
Mr. Sims.
Well, do we have a motion on the table already? I'm just trying to keep it straight in my head.
The motion to postpone can be, the motion to postpone supersedes the motion that's on the table.
Okay,
Right.
Thank you.
Any discussion on the motion to postpone? If not, if we can have the clerk call the roll on the motion to postpone to June 10th.
I'll just
wait 1 second, Mr. Flaherty.
Yeah, I'll just comment in support of the motion and why I supported it or would like for it. I just again will reiterate my general support of both appointing or hiring Mr. Lucas in this position, as well as my thanks and faith in Council President and Council Vice President in pursuing this. I just feel like to make a vote as a matter of due diligence, I need some additional level of report in terms of details of what the salary will be, how the number was arrived at, what we looked at. I think I will probably be, 99% sure that based on my working with you all so far, that I will be happy with what I learn and happy to support this. I just, again, as a matter of process and due diligence, would like to hear a little bit more details about that process before we're voting. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Flaherty. Any other comments? Clerk Bolden, do you have something?
Question, just for clarification.
Say again, please.
I have a question for clarification on the motion. Did you hear that?
I barely.
That's okay. Councilmember Rallo, is your motion to postpone the hiring until June 10th, 2020?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other comments before we take a vote? Again, Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
The motion was to postpone the vote on the hiring until
Yes.
June 10th.
Okay, thank you.
But we need to vote on the postponement.
Yes.
Councilmember Smith.
I was just going to say, I support Stephen, and I also support the idea. Let's put it off the next week, and I support that to postpone it to next week.
Thank you. Any other comments? Once again, I just want to reiterate my apology for not filing the report before the meeting so that you would have had a chance to consider all the details. I and Councilmember Sims will be happy to answer your questions between now and next week. And I will endeavor to give you as much insight as possible. With that, will the clerk please call the roll on the motion to postpone to a special session for June the 10th?
Councilmember Scamillary?
Yes.
Rosenbarger?
Yes.
Sims?
Yes.
Volin?
Yes.
Piedmont Smith?
Yes.
Flaherty?
Yes.
Smith?
Yes.
Sandberg?
Yes.
And Rallo?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, we will postpone that to a special session on June the 10th. Are there any other appointments to boards and commissions? Seeing none, we'll go to legislation for second reading and resolutions. Madam Parliamentarian.
Mr. President, I move that ordinance 2010 be introduced and read by the clerk by title and synopsis only.
Second.
We have motion and second. Will the clerk please call the roll on the motion to introduce?
Councilmember Rosenbarger?
Yes.
Sims?
Yes.
Volin?
Yes.
Piedmont Smith?
Yes.
Flaherty?
Yes.
Smith?
Yes.
Sandberg?
Yes.
Rallo?
Yes.
Scamillary?
Yes.
It seems we have a 9-0. Will the clerk please read by title and synopsis?
Maybe. There we go. Ordinance 2010 to amend Title 15 of the Bloomington Municipal Code entitled Vehicles and Traffic regarding amending BMC Chapters 1548, Removal and Impoundment of Vehicles, and 1552, Abandoned Vehicles, to align rules for city-initiated tows with non-consensual tows. The synopsis is as follows. This ordinance brings rules governing publicly initiated tows under Title 15 into line with recently adopted rules for non-consensual tows codified in Title 4. By making the rules for maximum charges and for release of towed vehicles uniform in both Title 4 and Title 15, this ordinance will result in more clarity for the public and easier administration of towing rules for both public and private actors. The Administration Committee recommendation is due pass 4-0-0.
Thank you.
Mr. President, I move that ordinance 2010 be adopted.
Second.
We have a motion and a second here to present. Who is here to present on this issue?
Council President Michael Rooker is here to present this ordinance very briefly, I think.
Mr. Rooker, could we see you or are you voice only?
I am unfortunately voice only. My laptop is not equipped with a webcam, so you will have to endure just hearing me.
All right. Well, we encourage you to go ahead, even though we can't see your bright, shiny face.
Thank you. And thank you, members of the Common Council. I come before you tonight with a simple, what I would describe as a simple cleanup ordinance, Ordinance 2010. As you recall, earlier this year, the Council proposed and adopted an ordinance establishing rules for non-consensual towing performed within the city. During that process, the administration and the Council, I believe as well, expressed their preference that the rules for both non-consensual or private tows align with the rules in place for public tows or tows initiated by the Bloomington Police Department. By updating the rules for public tows, Ordinance 2010 creates one uniform set of rules for public and private tows in Bloomington. Having one uniform set of rules for both public and private tows, number one, makes it easier for members of the public to understand rules related to towing. Number two, it makes it easier for towing companies to comply with the city's rules on tows. And number three, it makes it easier for police officers and other city staff members to ensure that when they're enforcing our towing rules, they're doing it correctly. So to that end, Ordinance 2010 proposes a handful of changes to the rules governing public tows. Number one, it increases the total base towing fee that may be charged for public tows from $125 to $135. Ordinance 2010 requires towing companies to release a vehicle upon payment of 20% of the total fees owed, provided that the owner of the vehicle signs an agreement to pay the remaining balance. And Ordinance 2010 clarifies that storage charges may not be assessed with regard to a towed vehicle until that vehicle has been in storage for at least 24 hours. Those rules should all sound very familiar, I hope, to the council, as they are the same rules that the council crafted earlier this year as part of the non-consensual towing ordinance. And so we ask that the council adopt proposed Ordinance 2010, and I'm happy to address any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Rooker. Are there questions for Mr. Rooker on Ordinance 2010? Do I see a show of hands? Anybody have questions about this ordinance? Seeing no questions from my colleagues, we'll go to the public for comment on Ordinance 2010. If you are interested in speaking to it, please raise your hand in Zoom or type into the chat. Is there anyone who would like to speak to Ordinance 2010? Mr. Lucas?
I don't see anyone.
Okay, back to the council for debate. Is there any final comment on Ordinance 2010?
Call the question.
Well, there's no need to call the question. If there's simply no questions, I can go to the clerk for a roll call vote on Ordinance 2010 as presented. Will the clerk please call the roll?
You're muted. There you
I
go.
see that. Councilmember Sims,
Yes.
Councilmember Volin,
Yes.
Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Flaherty,
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
Sandberg,
Yes.
Rallo,
Yes.
Scambolery,
Yes.
Rosenbarger.
Yes.
Thank you.
Ordinance 2010 passes 9-0.
Mr. President, I move that Resolution 2008 be introduced and read by the clerk by title and synopsis only.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Will the clerk please call the roll on introduction of Resolution 2008?
Councilmember Volin,
Yes.
Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Flaherty,
Yes.
Smith,
Yes.
Sandberg,
Yes.
Rallo,
Yes.
Scambolery,
Yes.
Rosenbarger,
Yes.
and Sims.
Yes.
Okay.
Will the clerk please read by title and synopsis?
Resolution 2008, approving the City of Bloomington's Transportation Management Plan. The synopsis is as follows. This resolution is sponsored by Councilmember Piedmont Smith. It cites the City of Bloomington's comprehensive plan's references to efficiently manage parking and to utilize transportation demand management strategies, and accepts the 2020 Transportation Demand Management Plan as an advisory document.
Thank you.
Mr. President, I move that Resolution 2008 be adopted.
Second.
All right, who is here to speak to 2008? Councilor Piedmont Smith, are you presenting or is staff presenting?
I am hoping that Ms. Beth Rosenbarger will present.
Beth Rosenbarger.
Yes.
Are you also presenting by audio only?
I am, but I will have images on the screen as well.
Okay. We need to get some cameras to staff. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Okay, let's see. All right. And is everyone seeing my screen as well?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Great, thank you. Okay, so I am Beth Rosenbarger with the Planning and Transportation Department. I am the Planning Services Manager, and I am here to present the Transportation Demand Management Plan. And I'm going to do my best to be brief because I did receive a lot of really great and detailed questions from council members. So I'm confident you all read the plan, and I hope you had a chance to review those answers. But if not, I'm happy to go over any question I can at the end of the presentation as well. So just to do an overview, I will talk generally just about transportation in terms of supply and demand. It feels really basic, but with transportation, sometimes these are difficult for us to separate and a little complicated. Then transportation demand management. What do we mean when we say that? What types of policies and programs are we talking about? I'll go over just 3 key recommendations in the plan. There are a lot of recommendations in the plan. I chose to just focus on 3. I'm happy to do my best to answer questions about any of them. And then, of course, time for questions. So the first big note about transportation is that transportation is a derived demand. I think that is a somewhat fancy term to mean what we actually demand is to get places. So we have to remember that from the beginning. It's quite basic, but we get lost because we're so used to the systems that we have and how we fit within them. So it's just important to remember that people demand to get places, and transportation is the way we get there. That's the derived demand. And what people choose is based on what is available to them, what they know about, maybe what they know is available to them. There might be more things available that they don't know about. What is convenient and what is incentivized in terms of behavior and more. So it's very complicated the way people make these decisions, and remember that as well. There's not just one way that somebody makes a decision about how to get places that impacts everyone. So when we talk about transportation supply and the supply side of it, we're talking about our streets. We're talking about motor vehicle lanes on streets, transit routes. Transit gets a little trickier because it's less tangible sometimes. If there's greater frequency on a route, that is also a supply. If there are more bus stops, that is also a supply. If we add routes, even though that's not necessarily adding streets, that is adding to supply. Sidewalks are a supply solution. Bicycle lanes or other bicycle facilities, trails, and parking. All of those are components of the supply side of our transportation system. And when we look at supply solutions, what we're looking at is shifting behavior by adding to or removing from or doing anything with that supply. You could say with a sidewalk, it could be by building a sidewalk. It could also be by adding a tree plot between a sidewalk and the street. And that is still a supply side solution. So for example, adding a lane to a street increases supply and increases driving. That's called induced demand. Or for example, adding a trail, such as the B line, increases supply and increases trail use and results in induced demand. For fun, I like to look at old photos and images of Bloomington right here. So this is an example of 10th Street at the bypass from 2007. And then from 2018, we can see a lot of supply was added here. So there are a lot more lanes added to this intersection in 2018. And that clearly, there are also sidewalks on both sides There were only sidewalks on one side previously, but this is very focused on a supply side solution. Similarly, we can look at this image from 2007. I love people to guess where images are, but I won't let you. This is at 2nd Street looking north, and a supply that was pursued here is the B line. And so previously, it was previously it was a rail line, then abandoned, then converted to a trail. That is also a supply solution. So I think we mostly think of transportation in terms of supply. And so the shift to demand is tricky. So some demand solutions are about shifting behavior with information, education, incentives, programs, and pricing. And this uses the infrastructure that is in place. So from the perspective of this plan, we are talking about any infrastructure that already exists. It can also include infrastructure we add in the future. Maybe we will do other things to shift the supply of transportation facilities in our community, but we would still want to couple that with demand solutions to let people know about those facilities, to encourage them to use them, and so forth. So when we want to look at examples of demand strategies, I am happy to use this that maybe a lot of people have used or not. If you are familiar with Uber or Lyft, when you try to call a ride on Uber or Lyft during certain times where there's a lot of demand, there's a thing called a surcharge, or the surge, sorry. So that means Uber is responding to this increased demand by increasing the price, which therefore results in usually fewer people taking it, but they also use it as a tool to increase the supply of drivers. So if a driver sees that they could make 9 times the normal amount, they might choose to come out, and then it shifts more rapidly than we see in our transportation system. So pricing is an example of a demand side solution. So changing pricing impacts demand, and high demand can result in higher prices. Another fun example of this, I would ask you to think about if you have driven yourself ever to the Indianapolis airport or to any airport for a trip that you are taking. So if you traveled to the airport, consider how parking pricing is structured at the airport. As you drive up to, if you want to get to the terminal, the closest parking spaces cost the most. We're actually very used to this, I think, if you are someone who gets to fly places. You make your choice, or I would say, how does the cost of parking at the airport impact your decisions there? Do you ignore these, or do you take into consideration the different prices in the different lots in terms of where you're parking your car? There might be times that you are making a very short trip there and you are late, and you are willing to park in a closer lot to save the time and pay more money. There are other times that you are planning ahead and do get there earlier and park farther away. There might even be other times that you're going to be gone for a long time and you look into taking the airport shuttle. But this was just for the pricing at the airport. And then additionally, you might be familiar, there are parking lots not even at the airport. So the farther away you get, those are usually even cheaper. And I think we could agree that the price of parking in the different lots impacts your choices that you make if you're parking at the airport. So in terms of transportation demand management, we're looking at using demand-based strategies to shift behavior. So I think that's similar to thinking about the airport parking lot. It does not include adding infrastructure, adding bus routes, or adding bus service. It does include reducing or combining trips, parking pricing, incentive programs, and more. So one example that's discussed in the plan is about carpool and van pooling. And that is because this is focused on getting people to work. So if people are going to the same destination, you can incentivize that trip or incentivize sharing a ride or carpooling through both the cost of parking permits. If a carpool parking space, that permit could cost less than other permits. That parking space can be more attractively located. You can do different things along those lines to help incentivize that. It could be that your employer will even cover the cost of a carpool parking space, but does not cover the cost of a single occupancy vehicle parking space. Or if they chip in the same amount, you will pocket some extra if you're in the carpool spot. So that's one example of a strategy. This also does include educating employees and employers and residents about options that may be available to them now. So there's discussion of what facilities we do have that exist, and sometimes people actually don't know about them. As it turns out, I usually have a hard time remembering this since I'm very familiar with the streets in Bloomington, but not everybody knows necessarily about a neighborhood greenway option that might be really close to them, or a more comfortable way to connect to the B line or something along those lines. And this does include understanding that providing parking is providing a fringe benefit to employees as well. So when we think of incentives and shifting demand, of course, we have to look at our system now and how that's functioning. So if an employer provides a parking space to employees, imagine, of course, there are some employees who don't own a car or are unable to drive to work for any reason. If they are not provided something of equal value, then they are missing out on a benefit, a fringe benefit that other employees are receiving. So when we look at parking and parking pricing, we have to remember that there's a value associated with that. And if you're looking to shift behavior, you need to find ways to provide that value to all employees, really. So shifting to key recommendations in the plan. A big one is to hire new staff or additional staff. The plan recommends 2.5 employees, so 2 full-time staff and 1 part-time staff member. It does a great job. There's a detailed budget and information included in the plan. I'm happy to do my best to answer any questions about that. And staff recommend starting with 1 employee and building a program. So start with 1 person, 1 full-time staff, and work on building that and continuing to expand from there. And any questions? I think there's often just a question of can't we do this already? That would be great. I would be happy to enumerate the things everybody on my team is doing and how challenging it would be to fully commit to doing this program while adding it on to existing positions. And final, people have very specific expertise in transportation demand management. And so thinking of hiring new staff to take those roles on, it would be a great benefit to hire people who specialize in this as well. Another key recommendation is implementing car share. If there are many residents of neighborhood parking zones that do not use their vehicles daily, yet they own and maintain the vehicles. And they park those vehicles on public streets. We know that because they're buying a neighborhood parking zone pass. And car share is a tool to provide vehicles that serve more people and take up less space. So each car share vehicle, different estimates say, reduces 15 to 20 other vehicles if they're, memberships and people subscribe to that program. So this recommendation came specifically from looking at the residential parking survey, and that involved a survey that went out to neighborhood parking zone residents who were purchasing parking zone permits. And that also involved some follow-up questions. So it involved asking them how they commute on a daily basis and what days they use their car and what are the purposes of the trips for which they're using a car. And it did find that most were, or a lot were errands, and most were not using a car to commute to work. So these are neighborhoods that are close to the downtown, usually close to downtown and campus, and really examined what would be effective strategies there. So when we look at car share, it's a nice infographic I found. For every rented car, there are 15 fewer owned cars on the road. When we think specifically about parking and we think of the space that might mean, this is a block on 6th Street between Lincoln and Grant, just on the north side of the Monroe County Public Library. There are actually 14, you can see 14 parking spaces right now on the street. So that's 14 metered spaces. And imagine if one car was doing the work of those 14. That's on the low side, actually. So we can also think of one car. There are other estimates that say it can replace 20. That is one side of the square on the courthouse. So I think it's nice to just put that space into perspective. Both of these examples I'm using were faster for me to find than a neighborhood zone, but this would be more relevant to the neighborhoods where those parking zones are established. But I just wanted to use these as visuals since we're familiar with these spaces. And the third recommendation I'm touching on is to increase parking pricing. So the plan recommended to increase pricing for parking permits. It also recommends looking at different permit payment options. And that means how often people pay or what their permit is covering. So that means offering different types of permits, such as carpool and van pool permits. That also means the time period allotment for a permit. So if it's daily or weekly or a certain number of days in a month. Because if you think about it right now, if your only option is to buy a month-long permit and then you choose to or able to walk, bike, take transit, carpool one day or once a week, you have already paid for your permit. So you're less likely to make that shift. To sunk cost, you might as well drive at that point. But if you are able to pay for something that gives you some flexibility, then it is helping you see the financial incentive for shifting that behavior. And the plan talks about, I would say, it's broken down into two groups. It focuses on downtown employees and then neighborhood residents with neighborhood parking zone permits. And it focuses based on a stakeholder group about occupancy vehicle use. If the goal is to reduce that, we need to think of how we will measure success. So we know one metric would be reduced single occupancy vehicle commute rates to the downtown. But in order to measure that in conjunction with the success of the downtown, they recommended looking at other economic indicators of the downtown in conjunction with that, so that we would know people are still coming downtown and people are still doing business and working downtown. They're just getting there differently. And so this graphic is from the National Association for Transportation Transportation City Officials and NACTO. And I think it does a great job, because what I think is important to reiterate with transportation demand management and this plan is we're not trying in any way to discourage people from coming downtown or from getting around town. We are trying as a community to look at our goals and find efficient ways for people to do that and ways that meet our goals. And so when we look, this graphic shows you the capacity of a single 10-foot lane and how many people move within that space. So even if we reduce single occupancy vehicle use to the downtown, we can look at how we are shifting and providing ways for more people to get there. So my only point is, just if it reduces, it doesn't mean fewer people are going downtown. And that's the end of my presentation. This is a graphic I am borrowing from Austin, Texas, but that's it.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenbarger. Can we unshare the screen so we can see people again? Are there any questions about the city's proposed transportation demand management plan from council members? My screen is updating very slowly, so it's hard for me to see.
Councilmember Rosenbarger.
Thank you,
Steve.
Mr. Sims.
You're welcome.
Yes, Councilmember Rosenbarger, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, okay. I have a question. I did ask this in the 30-something question list, but I just kind of want to go over it a little more. And you touched on it. Thanks very much for your presentation. The idea of measuring success to me based on economic development seems very difficult. I mean, right now, we're in COVID times. We don't know what that's going to look like. So what would that look like? I mean, where would we get a baseline for that? Would it be dollars? Would it be people? I guess to me, it just feels very disconnected. If the goal of TDM is to reduce SOV use, then to marry that with a success that is about economic development downtown.
Okay, is that the end of the question? Sorry.
It is, yes.
Okay, so the question about how would that be measured? And then is that, I guess, the best metric? I am not completely sure how it would be measured. I think first, that is something we would want to work out with someone that we hire to do this full time, but that it doesn't have to be set in stone from this moment. I think we know that a goal is to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips. That one we can measure through surveys, and we can continue to get that data point. And that one, let's say, even surveys are difficult and time consuming, but that is relatively straightforward. What I think the stakeholders wanted to capture by that other part is to know that in conjunction with those reduced single occupancy vehicle trips, that downtown continues to be vibrant. And I think there could be lots of ways of measuring that. I don't think it has to be just one, like it doesn't need to only be downtown GDP or something. But I think that could continue to be a conversation, and that would love kind of vibrant downtown metrics that could be considered for that as well.
Okay, yes, thanks. My follow-up question on that is, and maybe this wouldn't, would be for like the expert you hire if we hire someone. Could we, if we're looking at economic development, could it also be tied in somehow, like to figure out how people are getting downtown and like what they're spending their money on? So sort of like, I biked to this restaurant, right? Or like I spent money in the bookstore, I walked here. So then we would also get metrics on, right, who's coming in what ways and like who's spending money. Just because I've seen some infographics about how much biking, like the bike industry can bring in terms of economic development. And I think that would be neat if we could have that metric too.
I think I don't personally know how to do that, but I think it's something that could be explored because the TDM and these strategies are focused actually on employees. We would maybe also want to think of workforce metrics, could look at that, and could look at other well-being metrics. I basically would say, yes, I think that is something worth looking into, but I don't have more, I guess, expertise on it to contribute at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith had her hand up, then Councilmember Rollo.
Yes, I had a question about the car share program. So in your survey of downtown residents, it was noted that many do not use their car every day, and many use it primarily on weekends. So if we have a car share program, I'm wondering if I'm predicting the problem that everybody will want those few cars at the same time on a weekend. So could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Yes. So basically, if there's high demand for the car share, the consultants, Wells and Associates, who put the plan together, did recommend, and I forget, was it 20? Starting with 20 vehicles. I'm sorry, I'd have to look it up really fast in the plan, but that is based on demand. So another way to look at it would be, well, how do we deal with all the parking for the vehicles as well, if everybody has one? But I think it's something that has to be tinkered with and figured out over time. But people who run car shares do work on those equations and figure that out as a system regularly. So I think based on the demand, I mean, that's similar. It's similar to a bike share or to scooter share. It's just that it's a car. So I think looking at the population, the target audience for subscriptions, and managing that would be part of ensuring it could be successful. Because I think if people go to the car share and don't find a car there, they're less likely to continue subscribing and so on. And I think another thing would be, even if people are using their cars on the weekend, are they all using them at the same time? I don't think these aren't people, based on the survey, the types of trips we're talking about are errands in town. So not, I'm taking the car away for the weekend to go visit my family. So would somebody shift their errands potentially based on the availability of the car? And they also have an option to reserve it in different strategies like that. So I think that's something that would be considered with the program, and we would just want to make sure there are enough vehicles to make it successful for users.
Thank you.
Councilman Borrello.
Mr. Rosenberger, I had a question about methodology, and I noted that the response rate of the downtown employees survey was only 9%. And could you speak to that in terms of potential bias? Because it seems with so few respondents, you could have different demographic groups overrepresented, or age groups, or service employees versus other employees. And could you also explain, with such a low response rate, why was only 10 days given for people to respond?
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to pull it up quickly as well. So I think, and I wish I did have the consultant here. Statistically speaking, it is a high response rate for the survey. The aim was 10%, and it got really close to that. I guess 12. Oops, sorry, not that one. So they did statistical analysis to a level that is just actually very good in terms of the survey, and looked at how statistically significant the answers were and the amount of potential error in those responses as well. So I think there is potential for bias, but looking at the error that they included in there is something to keep in mind. So the margin of error they have is 2.83%. And I'll say the total number of downtown employees of 13,000 people was based on a number from Downtown Bloomington, Inc. I did actually just look it up in their records, and it's slightly under 13,000, 12,284, which actually increases that and reduces the margin of error. But it does not include IU employees, which people do think often. or I should say, it does not include IU campus. There are a few IU offices throughout the downtown, and those employees could have been counted and could have responded to this, but it was based on the geographic location of the employer. So we use the same boundaries that Downtown Bloomington Inc. uses for that. So mainly, I might just respectfully say I disagree about how low that response rate is. The 10 days was still based on a recommendation from the consultants, and that we were trying to hit a target number of responses, and we were really close to it. And then the time of year made it just a little challenging as well. But I'm sorry, I think I answered, but kind of roundabout. Sorry.
No, it's good. So, you know, since the consultant's not here, I don't have the opportunity to ask about like weighting or whether, you know, certain, groups were filtered or whatnot. But is that raw data available to us? Could we get that the survey response and so forth, and who answered and so forth, just so we could also, you know, because a lot is riding on this, obviously, you know, the conclusions.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, we can. Of course, the answers were anonymous participation in the survey. It did ask questions about income, but it did not ask a lot of demographic questions. And part of that was the trade-off between keeping the survey as short as possible in order for people to take it. The more questions that you ask, people bail on a survey and stop taking it. And also with some personal information, people get wary to share that as well. But I'm happy to follow up and find the raw data and make that available. And if you have other detailed questions about it as well, please feel free. I can try to get those answered as well.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any further questions on Resolution 2008? Councilmember Smith, and then Scambaluri.
There were some questions that I sent. I don't know if Ms. Rosenbarger is going to address the questions that we sent her.
You mean the questions that were answered already? Did you want her to go over those?
The ones that I sent in about
they were
about the cost to the city.
Are you asking a follow-up question based on the written answers that they provided already?
I don't have any written answers to my questions, so I don't.
Just a point of information, they were sent out to an email to all council members, it looks like this afternoon, along with a few other supplemental materials from Mr. Lucas.
Right, that's what I was trying to get at, Mr. Smith. Did you want to ask her to go over some of the answers to your questions, or did you have new questions?
Yeah. Okay. Well,
just a point of information. We got those pretty late in the day, and I did send out an email. I didn't have time to issue another supplement to our meeting packet, but I did send those on to council members. It was late in the afternoon, so you may not have seen those before the meeting.
Yeah, internet died later today. So,
Mr. Smith, go ahead and ask
questions.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, if I understand it, the program budget is about $500,000 a year. And so one of the questions that I wanted to ask was, what are the benefits for that expenditure? And meaning how many people, if we're going to decrease the single occupancy use from 62 something percent to 60%, how many people does that mean in that process?
Yes, thank you. And I can add my apologies. I know you all did receive the answers pretty late. We tried to answer all of them, and I know I received some earlier. So my apologies on that. And part of the challenge was yesterday we were closed. But let me touch base on that. So what are the benefits? The first thing I would note is that I know we continue to say the goal of reducing single occupancy vehicle use from 62% to 60%. But what we found from the downtown employee survey is that 78% of downtown workers drive to work alone. So the 62% number of commuters comes from the US Census, and it is only measuring people who live within the city of Bloomington. And of course, around the city at any geographic point or destination, it could be higher than that or lower than that. But part of it is that commuters who come to downtown are also coming from outside the city. So some live within the city and live, can take a bus, and some live outside of city limits. So when we look at the difference of 78% single occupancy vehicle use to the downtown compared with 60%, that's actually a shift based on 13,000 downtown employees and 2,340 single occupancy vehicle commutes. So I would say a major benefit of the program, if we can achieve that shift, would be that reduction in SOV commutes. And depending on the distances of those commutes and what mode they shift to, that would represent a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as reductions in traffic and other forms of air pollution. And additionally, when we reduce vehicle miles traveled by motor vehicle, safety improves because the more vehicle miles traveled, the more crashes there are. So I know that's not quantified. I think somebody would be able to put numbers to that if we do an average distance for the commute and then look at the greenhouse gas emissions, and that in 2,340 commute shifting modes would be pretty significant. And so that would be my answer, I guess, on what you get out of it.
And what is the cost to the city budget per annum?
Let me pull up the page really quickly.
I looked at a bunch of numbers. I read the plan very carefully. We have to have a match and a funding stream. Is it 20% of $500,000?
So it depends on how the program is funded. The federal funds are one route, although also not guaranteed. Local funds then would be the full amount. In terms of looking at the program budget, it would be lower to start with fewer people, of course. So I'm sorry, the total, for year one, where it includes 2.5 staff members, was $490,000. Some of the costs are really parts of the city budget already, but in terms of, offices and things like that, that would obviously benefit from being housed with an entity that exists. But in terms of, I guess, a detailed examination of what we would be looking to request in the budget, I think I have to defer to my department head and kind of see what would be proposed at the budget time. That I don't think we're making a request for that full amount at this time.
And does it say in the transportation plan that the part of the idea is perhaps to fund the TDM program, that we may increase parking fees 50% or greater, or is it just the permits that are 50% or greater?
That's a good question. My understanding is the focus on parking pricing in the report is parking permits for employees downtown, which are overwhelmingly garage permits or permits for a lot. And that is where the discussion of 50% is. And then the neighborhood parking zone permits were a separate conversation or a separate recommendation that said the city should look at increasing it to more than $40 a month, where they are currently $45 a year. In other conversations with the consultants, they did say parking pricing is complicated, not surprising, and that looking at how much you would increase and over what time would be something you would do in a very detailed analysis. And their analysis was focused just on shifting behavior, so it was a bit more blunt, and that they would recommend doing a deeper dive on that before you just jump in. You wouldn't just jump in and start with a 50% increase.
And then I have one more question, and I'm sorry that I didn't see all the internet was down all around the city for a while. I read it and I thought about it for a few days as well. Are the initiatives to adopt a transportation demand plan and build new parking garages, does that seem in opposition?
I think, so we did answer this in the questions, that one would be a supply side. Well, I would say the plan is a demand-focused plan, and parking falls under the supply side, and then the ways that we regulate parking falls under the demand side. So I think they go together, I guess, but yeah, I think we have to examine the supply we have and then how we use it to the best of our ability or most efficiently to reach our goals.
Seems like if we did a great job with the TDM, maybe we don't need one of the parking garages. Well, that's what popped in my head. So thank you very much for entertaining my questions. And I'm sorry I didn't see them when they came through. So thank you, Ms. Rosenberg.
That's very fair. They came out late, and then apparently the internet has been off, like you said, in a lot of the city. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Are there further questions for Resolution 2008 from members who have not yet had a chance to ask questions? Councilmember Scambaluri.
Thank you. First, a quick question to Mr. Lucas. Just to confirm, will the questions and answers that we received this afternoon be available on the website as well for the public?
We can certainly post another supplement to the packet. We got those answers and a few presentation materials that ended up not being used tonight during the report section that we can post to the packet on our
Great.
website.
Okay, because the questions I think themselves were informative, as were the answers. So Ms. Rosenberger, thank you for your presentation. Very helpful, and I learned a lot from reading this report, so I'm grateful. A couple things I want to nudge on a little bit. One of the questions I asked focused on the fact that the proposed sources of revenue that are going to pay for all this are kind of unreliable money for the long term. Particularly the federal money seems like good startup, but it's not typically meant to be sustained over time. And then your response was that the TDM plan recommends identifying a sustainable revenue stream, and that could mean local funding. Can you talk more about what that means and perhaps what Fort Collins, Colorado and Portland, Maine, the two cities that we were benchmarked against, what did they do to do that? Because I guess I'm still not clear on what local funding means. Is that property taxes? Is that something else?
Great question. I generally, maybe too cynically, think that no funding source is reliable, but so I think local funding, I'm sorry, I would have to dig into it a little bit more in terms of the peer communities. So are mainly, some have options that we don't have in terms of air quality funding. So that's off the table for us. Luckily, our air is clean enough that we don't qualify for that, but it does mean we don't have that money. So Portland, Maine, it comes from the city's operating budget. And then in Fort Collins, they do a combination of federal, state, and local. I would have to reach out or follow up to find out what that local means, but I tend to assume that means the city's operating budget. So like you were saying, yes, that would be property taxes. There were other recommendations of if within the plan you can use parking funding or parking revenue to support a program like this as well. But mainly those are the predominant local options that I can think of, but I would also note, others in the administration will know more about budget options, honestly, than I do.
Okay. I'd be interested in knowing more about what that could be. And I'm curious, do you happen to know, if you don't know right now, that's fine, but did Fort Collins or Portland or any of the cities mentioned in the report raise property taxes to do this, or do a lit to pay for their program?
I don't know offhand, but it just says the city's operating budget. So I would think maybe someone could weigh in on that, that a lit is, I don't know if a lit counts outside of the operating budget or not. I would think the operating budget is more similar to just how our department is funded. So did they raise taxes, or I'll look into that and circle back.
Okay, great. And one additional question, and I may well be the only one struggling with this, but the report talked about the differences between carrots and sticks. Carrots as things that will identify people to do something other than drive alone in a car, and sticks as something that would, in a sense, almost penalize people who do. And the report talked about the desire to use more carrots than sticks, and I think that's great. One of the things I asked about is public transit, and I appreciate that that's a supply side solution. I represent a district for which large swaths are either unserved or underserved by public transit. And so cars are the option for getting downtown. And there are no walkable paths to do that either. And so for me, I'm having a really hard time separating out supply side solutions and demand side solutions because they seem so intertwined to me. And I was wondering if you could comment on that and whether we're moving toward a comprehensive list of responses to this, or how that's going to play out. That was a really vague question. I'm sorry, but I'm hopeful you got the gist. So.
Yes, that was really big. Thanks. So I think the first part is there are areas that aren't served by transit. And so do people have other options who live there? So first I would break that down and just say the plan is about down in terms of if that area is not a neighborhood parking zone. So it is focusing on then shifting behavior of downtown employees. So how many people in that area are downtown employees? And then if they are, one option is they're going to the same destination. Maybe they live close together. And so carpool is what we would look at for that. So that it doesn't mean right now that everyone could shift to the bus or everybody could shift to walking, but we have to look at what existing options are available to them. And so carpool might be that option. It could mean they pay less than for a parking pass, and it could mean they get a preferred or better parking spot. And that might be the best option for them right now. Another thing to consider is most likely there are people within that area who already don't have those facilities and are making other choices, even though they are uncomfortable. And those people, if their employer is providing a parking pass, but they can't afford a car, are losing out on that benefit. So they would benefit from some option that's made available to them, or a transit pass, maybe if they can walk to a transit route that is even closer than compared with nothing. But then I think supply side solutions are still on the table, and they're very much things we still need to do as a community. So looking at transportation demand management doesn't mean we should stop pursuing those things whatsoever. I would say I specialize in infrastructure design for walking and bicycling. And we know it's important to continue to build that infrastructure and make it increase bus and do other things to make those options available to more people. I think that we just have to think of these as paired and that they will work together because, that's how we can have more shifts. But it's just that this plan is still, we can make some shifts based on what we have in place. So how do we look at making those shifts? And it's not about changing 50% of the population, but it's about changing 3% or 5% or something like that. Does that answer your question?
It sort of, yeah. It's a hard question to answer, so no worries there. But just a comment in response to that. I think again, I'm at least one of the people who has a hard time dividing up supply side solutions and demand side solutions. So as conversation goes forward on this report, I'll be asking, okay, exactly what are we talking about in each of those categories? Because as you've said, they do have to go together. So it's hard for me to separate them out, but I just offer that. And with that, I'll yield. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions on Resolution 2008? Councilmember, first round questions. I would like to ask one. Ms. Rosenbarger, the price of garage parking has to be set in conjunction with the price of street parking, right? Because if garage parking goes higher than street parking, then it might cause people who are parking for employment to park in spots on the street that are for customers and more itinerant visitors. Doesn't changing the rate of off-street parking dictate that we also change proportionally the rate of on-street parking?
Thank you for your question. I agree that they have to be examined as a parking system and that looking at what outcomes we want from the different parking options. And I don't agree necessarily with proportionally in your statement, but I do agree that the purpose of metered parking is to provide a quick, most often, or visible option to people. And that if you are making a shopping trip downtown, you might more often choose a metered convenient spot compared with the willingness to look for a spot in a garage and potentially walk a little bit farther. So I would say professionally, I agree that they're connected and that they have to be looked at as a system and that the prices have to have a relationship in that the purpose of a garage is more often longer term parking and more often less convenient parking. But we also do have to look at that as a system and decide if that is correct for all of our garages and for all of our meters, as there is variety among both of those and the lots as well.
I misspoke when I used the word proportional. It's really entirely a matter of the market in a given area, the demand within a small area. I mean, I appreciate the distinction. Thank you. Further questions on Resolution 2008? Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I wanted to ask, and mainly for the benefit of the public, since I know the answer basically, but I wanted to make sure the public understands to what extent there was public input and stakeholder input into the development of this plan. So could you please describe that?
Yes, I can. Thank you. So this plan, I would first explain is different than a comprehensive plan, and it is different than the transportation plan. And it is different because it is not based on adopting new community goals or based on, I would say, changing land use in our community. It is based on programs and policies around what we do already have in place and developing programs and policies that are in line with the goals that have been adopted. So this plan was developed by a consulting firm called Wells and Associates, and they engaged a stakeholder group that was, I would say, almost predominantly focused on the business community, as well as some other groups in the downtown. We had a representative from the Bloomington Arts Commission. We had representative from the Chamber of Commerce, BEDC, Downtown Bloomington, Inc. We also reached out to places that didn't participate, but that happens, as well as someone from the Monroe County Public Library, I believe, participated in several stakeholder meetings. So it was more based on input with a stakeholder group, where each of those stakeholders is representative of a larger group, and then based on statistical analysis of surveys. So the survey of downtown employees, which we discussed, and then a survey of residents who purchase neighborhood parking zone permits. And there is an additional follow-up survey of some people who did the neighborhood parking zone permits. So in terms of, I mean, I think it's very open to say this is less of a public engagement based plan and more of a technical expertise plan developed based on adopted community goals. So I don't think of this as establishing new goals, but rather providing recommendations that we as a city could choose from, more like a buffet in terms of implementation. That was a long answer, but did I address your question?
Yes, you did, and I appreciate putting it into context as well.
Thanks.
Thank you. Further questions on Resolution 2008? Councilmember Rosenbarger?
Thank you. My question is, okay, so thinking about the businesses participating in this, I know, so the plan said we have 5 businesses that are already engaged in some kind of program or incentive, right, for their employees to not drive their own vehicles and park. So how likely is it the downtown businesses will participate one way and another in this plan? I guess just kind of like compared to maybe what the consultant saw at other cities, like how successful that was. And then I noticed that the chamber wasn't on that list of 5. I don't think they were on that list. So did the consultants look at how chambers get involved in these plans? Because, you know, just thinking about how many small businesses there are downtown, and if the chamber can be like a leader in this and like set an example, and maybe, you know, potentially, I don't know how you join the chamber, but it'd be something where like, hey, you can join if you have, if you implement one of these plans, or you can get a discount on your joining fee if you implement one of these plans. So basically, my questions are, how likely is it that businesses participate in these types of plans? Because I know a lot of it has to be implemented at the business level. And then do you know anything about how chambers have been involved in implementing these at other cities?
Okay, thank you. So how likely is it that businesses participate? That I think depends on staffing. So to a certain extent, working with the business community, and a lot of these recommendations are employer-based. So it takes significant staff time to then work individually with different businesses throughout the downtown. So, you know, there are a lot of different businesses will have different unique attributes, but let's say a staff member can then develop, here is what a parking cash out plan will look like. Let me meet with you and talk about it. And let's talk about how you might need some of this to be changed in order to use at your business. Or let's talk about if you would like to participate in the free transit pass to employees, and how you sign up for that and how you provide this information to employees. And to a certain extent, it is a staff person creating those materials and providing them to employers. So instead of every small business doing that on their own and doing that research, it would really be, if it's housed in the city person, say the city staff member, providing those informational and marketing materials to employers. So I think their likeliness of participating would be based, I think, on the ability to have a successful program and the ability to provide that for them and do that work for employers who are managing a lot, of course, especially at a time like this. And then also in terms of looking at how it benefits them. So not just, we want you to do this for the community, but let's talk about how your employees are getting to work now, or let's talk about employee happiness, and that we have shifted, obviously, this during the pandemic to an unprecedented level of working from home and remote work. So we are in this space where so many employers never have not adopted remote work policies, and we've been thrown into it. So now some employees might be happier working from home 1 or 2 days a week. So let's talk with the employers and work with them and have, like tear out policies they can take and put in their employee handbook of like, this is what it means to work remote. This is how we develop expectations of each other. So that's my answer about how likely is it that businesses will participate. I think it's as likely as the effort we put in. And I think it's also hopefully some positive peer pressure from other members of the business community. It could look at doing some sort of designation. Businesses can apply to be bicycle friendly businesses. So looking at options like that to positively recognize businesses that are really trying to help us meet our city goals. And then the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce did participate. They were a stakeholder in this process. And I think because they work with so many businesses in the area, there are opportunities for business organizations like that or business advocacy groups to try to work with the businesses they represent as well. And that's my answer.
Yes, thank you. That was good. Sorry, yeah. And what I meant was I didn't think they were one of the 5 businesses that offer transit, like have a contract with transit, B2 Transit. And that's what I meant. I'm sorry, yes.
It's time to get to public comment. Are there any final second round questions from members? Seeing none, let's go to the public. Is there a member of the public who would like to address Resolution 2008? If so, please raise your hand in Zoom or type into the chat. Mr. Lucas?
We have Mr. Greg Alexander up first, who should be unmuted and ready to comment.
Mr. Alexander, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm Greg Alexander. This is pretty exciting. It's also a little bit frustrating because I'm sure some of you guys remember Buff Brown and BTOP. We've been kind of arguing for these kind of policies, like parking cash out for 15 years now. And we've been doing some of this kind of research of counting garages and trying to do transportation surveys downtown to figure out, how do people get to downtown businesses? We've been doing that all along too. So it's really exciting that now staff could potentially be doing some of that work, because that hopefully will inform supply side decisions. One thing I want to draw attention to, it's been remarked before, but this is a verbatim quote from the report. Most important finding from the follow-up survey of downtown residents is that most downtown residents are Indiana University students who use their cars infrequently and not for commuting purposes. And you saw that same when they surveyed people who had core neighborhood parking permits. They had that same finding that even though they had a car, they mostly did not drive to campus, did not drive to work. And I can really confirm that. I counted a 353 spot garage that's owned by an apartment complex at 11th and 11th and Rogers, 11th and Morton about, and it has that pattern. You know, I was counting occupancy, which never exceeded 52%, but it had, you know, you can tell a lot of these cars don't move during the week. I counted it intensely on a weekend, and yeah, a lot of them did move on the weekend, but not every car all at once. So I do think that we won't need to have the same number of rental cars. For example, that's something that we could answer if the city could actually study that problem. You know, I spent just a few hours counting it, maybe 10 hours counting the garage, but a staff member could throw a lot more detailed analysis at that. And I found the same thing also at the city-owned garage at Morton and 7th. That's largely used by, I think, Smallwood students. And you could really tell that there was the first 4 floors of that garage were 100% full, and the cars were not moving. Every car that came in and out of that garage for a daily, day-to-day trip had to go through 4 floors of full parking to get to an empty spot. And so they get the impression that the garage is full, but the top 2 floors are completely empty, you know? And that's all because of people who have cars, that we have subsidized the storage. We've given them incentives that they feel like they have to have a car, but they're not actually using them. And so they'll be really receptive if we change the incentive structure. And one more thing to keep in mind is that this kind of incentive structure, when they have a car, they use it for their errands. That encourages them, if they need to go shopping, they're going to go to Target. They're going to go to Target instead of Pygmalion's. Literally, we're saying that if you have a shopping errand, you should think of it as a car trip, and that discourages stores downtown from being open at all. And that's why we don't have anywhere downtown to buy basic staples that if you want this kind of stuff, you have to go to the east side. Well, that's because we make it so that the incentives are so that everybody that lives downtown has a car. So I'm really excited at the possibility of changing some of those incentives. And I think it really will be a worthwhile investment, because the city has spent just in last year, $30 million on parking garages. And so we really need to be studying that problem before we spend more money on parking. And the city spending on parking itself is actually a small part of the puzzle, because we also require parking out of private developers. And so, each one of these changes could potentially have very long-ranging effects and could save millions of dollars for multiple parties, public and private, at the same time as encouraging more business downtown. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Lucas, any other members of the public who wish to speak to this issue?
Yes, up next we've got Mary Morgan, who should be unmuted and ready to comment.
Ms. Morgan,
hello.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm Mary Morgan. I'm Director of Advocacy and Public Policy for the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce. And I heard you all talking about the chamber, so I just wanted to hop on and give our perspective. Yes, we're very interested. We participated in the TDM stakeholder group because transportation is a big issue for obviously residents, but also businesses, and trying to, get their employees to where they need to be. It's very tied into the housing market, as I'm sure most of you know. So we're interested. I do think that in terms of some feedback for the city, one of the things that we hear from employers when we're talking to them about the options is that the city offers its employees highly subsidized parking. So perhaps it's an opportunity for the city to lead by example in addressing some of its own benefits for employees regarding parking and transportation needs. Personally, I would say that having moved here a little over a year ago, the infrastructure is not quite in place to allow people to go totally car-free given our lifestyles. One example that I think you mentioned during the presentation was the zip car option or car sharing options. I don't think that they're sufficient at this point. It's kind of a chicken and egg question, but I certainly would not be able to give up my car given the infrastructure, whether it's the bus or car sharing at this point. So thank you for considering the TDM report, and looking forward to seeing where this goes. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there any other public comment? Please raise your hand in Zoom or type into the chat. Mr. Lucas, do we have any other takers?
Yes, we have a Sam Dove who should be unmuted. We're able to unmute himself or herself.
Mr. or Ms. Dove, would you please speak?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
Please go ahead. Do you have something to say to Resolution 2008?
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm not hearing anything. I don't know that there's anything to be gained by this public speaker for the time being. Can he type? Is there someone who can speak for her?
I will send this person a chat over Zoom and let them know that they could send a written message if they'd like.
I'll be happy to have it read.
Okay.
Okay, is there any other member of the public who would like to speak?
I don't see anybody else.
I will try to if they can send us a message while council members are speaking to the issue, we'll try and get their message in. But if there are no other members of the public who would like to speak at this point, we'll come back to the council for debate. Is there any final comment on Resolution 2008 or perhaps follow-up questions? Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yeah, I want to express my appreciation for Ms. Rosenbarger and the other members of the Planning and Transportation staff for engaging with the consultant and coming up with a solid plan. I do believe that this is the right thing to do based on our previous commitments and based on not only our transportation commitments, but our moral commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That said, the price tag is hefty. And in today's COVID-19 environment, I am not sure how soon we could actually invest the kind of money that is proposed here. So I'm in support of the plan as an advisory document. And I think we need to very carefully analyze how we can get the biggest bang for the buck, knowing that the bucks we have coming in will probably be decreasing because of the economic downturn. So fingers crossed, but I'll be voting in favor today. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Smith.
I'm going to ask Mr. Lucas a question and then make a comment, if that's okay.
Please go right ahead.
Mr. Lucas, when we vote for a resolution, what does that mean in terms of our commitment for any further action?
I believe this particular resolution states that the city is planning to use this document as an advisory document. I don't believe it binds the city to take any specific actions contained in the document. I think it's a way to make it known publicly that we're going to refer to this document and consider it when making decisions, but I don't believe it binds the city to any particular actions.
So it may lend itself to modification down the road as we look at this.
Ms. Rosenbarger may want to comment on whether the staff plans to keep this plan up to date or make modifications. This is a little different than the comprehensive plan, which we hired a consultant to write for us, but we took a big ownership in that document. I'm not sure if staff has the same plans for this document to kind of make it that living document like the comprehensive plan.
Okay, well, thank you. My comment on it is it's just quite a price tag in the COVID crisis. And that really is a sticking point in my mind. And I worry that if we are going to not have a lot of federal funds to match it, and the city is going to be unhooked for $500,000 a year, I worry that that's a lot right now when revenues are going to decrease as that wave of that COVID reduction comes through. So I'm not sure that I can support this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Sandberg.
Thank you. Again, as this is a non-binding resolution and it is an advisory document and largely aspirational and very future focused, I can support it tonight, but my colleagues have raised some excellent questions about the pragmatic realities on the ground, especially as we're all facing some pretty serious times ahead with some economic downturns. And I appreciate Mary Morgan for coming on. And I was kind of wondering if we were going to hear somebody from the business community, from the downtown. It may perhaps be a different downtown than even when the consultant was doing the legwork for this report. And so I think we all need to take a degree of caution moving forward here with respect to how much this may cost. Granted, there are probably going to be some savings involved as well, but that's kind of difficult for folks to wrap their heads around when stores may be closing and the fate of IU is still a little bit uncertain with what's going to be happening. Our own resources are going to be a little bit in flux, and the need to be cautious, I think, is something that we're all very mindful of. So I will support it. But in terms of it being executed, I would certainly advise the staff to be slow and cautious. Thank you.
Thank you. Further comment, Councilmember Flaherty.
Yes, thanks. I'm sorry for being off video quite a bit. I had a puppy that was having a fit. So he's okay now, he's asleep. Yeah, I'm glad the administration chose to develop this plan, and I think it's an important step towards managing our transportation system in the most cost-effective and equitable and low pollution way that we can. Goals that I think our community broadly shares across the business community and residents, and of course in our adopted plans. I certainly take the point of exercising caution and prudence in our fiscal decisions now more than ever, especially as we wait to see what the fiscal impact of any recession with COVID-19 may look like. But of course, we do need to actually implement this if we want to see results. Just like our sustainability action plan or the transportation plan, we need to actually follow through, which means prioritizing our plans in our annual budget, in appropriations ordinances, and in our policy decisions, even if that means shifting priorities. Not coming up with new money, but changing how it's spent. For instance, we've spent $900,000 a year on leaf collection, for instance. I know that's being explored as a possible shift, but that's a substantial amount of money. When we think about the cost of implementing a plan, it is important that we think about the savings associated with implementing that plan. We are in the process of spending actually $50 million, including interest, to build 2 parking garages. That is to increase the supply of parking. Before we ever undertook the efforts to reduce demand and shift behavior through tried and true methods. I mentioned in our budget advance the need for a parking cash out policy, not just at the city, but really in all sorts of places around the downtown. It is very well studied. It's been mandatory actually for businesses and government alike in California for nearly 30 years. Progressive cities all over this country have legislated transportation demand management programs for employers because it's the pathway to get to reduced pollution and emissions reductions that we know we have to make in the midst of a climate crisis. And we've had the business community before in conversations about this very issue, expressing their support for, I think Lynn Coyne at the time, head of the BEDC, said he wasn't asking for a free lunch. He, was supporting paying the full price of parking, and that he believed in rational solutions to climate change. This is about as, rational and tried and true as it gets. It's been studied for 30 years in California. Emissions reductions averaged 12% per business when they implemented TDM plans that were required by law. That's a substantial reduction in emissions. Certainly agree with Mary Morgan's comment about the need for the city to lead by example on some of these things, but I think we really need broad buy-in across the community. I guess just a quick note about carrots and sticks and thinking about this. I remember having this conversation in council chambers briefly, making a remark about this after we heard the TDM presentation from the consultant a couple months back, which is that when you have a large subsidy for something like parking, current parking permits are less than 50% of the actual cost of maintenance, operations, and capital debt finance. So when you have a very large subsidy and you reduce the size of that subsidy by increasing the price, that is not a stick. It is reducing the size of a carrot. And those carrots are fundamentally inequitable, the ones associated with single occupancy vehicle travel. This is, again, very well studied, very well accepted in among the professionals who work on this. We have taxpayers who cannot afford to drive, who are subsidizing the parking of people who don't need the subsidy, frankly. I am all in support of equitable subsidies for people who are low-wage earners in our downtown who actually need it. But if you're making $80K a year and you work downtown, the city shouldn't be subsidizing your parking. So just wanted that final note on carrots and sticks, because it's important, I think, for the frame and how we think about this to realize that when you're talking about reducing a subsidy for an activity that all of our goals say we need to reduce, that's not a stick. It's a reduction in the size of a carrot and a shift in behavior. So I think that's it for me. I will be supporting this resolution. I hope we can see some movement on it in the near future. I think there are portions of it that are actionable very soon, and I'll be following up with some of those. Thanks.
Thank you. Further comments from members on Resolution 2008? Councilmember Rallo.
Just a couple notes. One is to agree with Councilmember Sandberg. This is an aspirational document, so our acceptance of it directs us but doesn't compel us. But that said, I think that and knowing in a post-COVID world, we're going to have a reduction in revenues likely. We're also going to have a change in behavior. I think that, we're going to have more people telecommuting than we had in the past, and that's going to change things in terms of transportation. And in terms of reducing carrots, I generally agree. I would just be cautious that we don't reduce carrots that might harm people of low income. It was one of my concerns about metering downtown, was the accessibility of downtown for low-income residents of the community. So I'll be supporting this resolution. I hope we can aspire to it, and I hope it makes a significant difference in terms of transportation behavior and policy.
Thank you. Any other debate on Resolution 2008? Final comments? Councilmember Sims.
Thank you. I also, too, want to thank Ms. Rosenbarger and the consultant, I think, for this development in this report. And I, like some of my colleagues have mentioned, I can support this, and I will support this. But I think there's also some gaps within here that that could have been better explained, I think. Some things like I heard an incentivizing something about free transit pass for some businesses for their employees. And we've heard that before, but I haven't heard anything from a funding standpoint, who's willing to participate in that program, what is some of the education and information methods that we could use to make sure that works later. So I'm not so sure about that. 80, when I heard the 80K a year analogy, and that made sense to me. But I guess all of a sudden I'm thinking, what is the average salary of the people in this town? And I don't think it's anywhere near 80K. And I like to deal more along with medians or averages when dealing with our constituents. And that wasn't clarified within the document. And I'm sure it will be. We'll have more conversations as we move forward. We talked about, and I appreciate Ms. Rosenberger talking about reduction in greenhouse gases. And there was a lot to say, and I don't remember exactly there, but I made a note here, how significant of a reduction. So those are the type of details that I like, that we need to strive for, don't get me wrong. But I like more details as opposed to just say something or say significant. What does significant mean? And then there's costs associated with it. There was Uber examples or ride shares and surges and, 8% higher rates. And, those are all good and part of the report. I'm looking more at a reality standpoint. Generally, if the price for that is raised, then that automatically would, in most cases that I'm aware of, generate more drivers in order to transport people. So does that equate to having less single occupancy rides as we're talking, even if that's even possible? Is that a supply thing? Is that a demand thing? Is that part of the supply that's not part of the demand for this study? So I think overall and long term, and particularly in conjunction with our comp plan and some of our other plans, I think there's a place for it. But as we move forward, I'd just like to hear much more detail on funding. Some of these things that were said that weren't clear, I think, in my mind. But I will plan it. Last thing I do want to say, in going through the documents, there was a few musts, a lot of shoulds, and things like that. And I think longer term, I would prefer to hear could or may as opposed to should or must in an advisory document. So it was starting to sound a little bit more like an actual ordinance to me, as opposed to an advisory document. But all in all, I think it's something we'll deal with in the future. I just want to remember to have those conversations as we move forward, because as some of my colleagues have said many times in the past, words matter. And I don't want this to come back and not do what we intended to do in future conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other final comments on Resolution 2008 before I take a crack at it? Checking. Okay. Let me just say this document, just by articulating the idea of demand side management of our transportation system, is a significant moment in our city's history. This is of fundamental importance. For once, we're realizing that there are two sides of the equation, supply and demand. And for too many years, all we've thought about for any kind of transportation has been supply. All we're doing with this document is recognizing that we don't just have to build more supplies of parking. We can also control and make more flexible the demand for that supply. We should build more supplies for walking, which we've been doing for many years through the Sidewalk Committee. We've been trying to provide more supply in what we used to call alternative transportation. But it wasn't the alternative before the automobile. It was the way people got around. And it's still the way many people get around who can't afford an automobile or who don't always want to use it for any number of reasons. We should build more supply for safe bike riding. We can create baby carrots instead of always handing out Bugs Bunny-sized carrots. We can maybe give out smaller bags of baby carrots. We can maybe target bags of baby carrots to those people who need it. You can already see demand side management in use at IU. If you've ever tried to park itinerantly at an IU garage, you'll see if you look at the sign that the first hour costs you something like $3. If you stay for a second hour, it costs you $4. If you stay for a third hour, it costs you $5. They have escalating prices for parking to try to tamp down the demand for long-term parking there. They don't necessarily want, if you're going to park long-term on a regular basis, they want you to buy a permit. But it's already in use here in this city. You can see it. But I take Councilmember Smith's concern to heart, and I want to say that I very strongly believe that we are not going to need federal funding to fund the initiatives that this plan calls for, that the money to manage transportation demand is already inherent in the system itself. There's a whole bunch of excess demand because we underprice many things. But I'll just point out this. The 2016 Parking Commission report showed that the overall gross revenue of the parking system was on the order of $7 million. And it had generated a $200,000 surplus in that year. Now we're in a very different environment now, obviously. But demand, until the crisis struck, demand has been higher than supply since we implemented meters 7 years ago. Prices needed to be increased on the street at least 2 years ago. We increased prices in garages at the end of 2018 because they had been insufficient to regulate demand. So forget for a minute just the idea that pricing should be increased because cars have been getting a lot of subsidy. That's true. I believe that. But you should believe that prices should be adjusted, if not necessarily increased, based on, simply put, on the demand for the existing supply that we have. Even when we build new garages, I prefer fewer rather than more, but you're not going to see demand satisfied, even if you add all that supply, unless you price it correctly. It's always going to have made a difference how you price the supply that you have. And I'll also point out that when meters were implemented, when we started regulating demand for parking through meters 7 years ago, I like to cite the rough numbers. In 2013, or 2012 rather, the year before the meters were implemented, tickets roughly brought in about $1 million in gross revenue. Garages brought in about $1 million in gross revenue. After the first year that meters existed, the amount that came in from garages went down by 1%, maybe. It was about the same. The amount that came in from tickets was about the same, about $1 million each. The amount that came in from meters was 2.2 million. That's how much latent demand there was for parking. And even now at $1 an hour, we haven't charged enough for parking. And I can show you the blocks of downtown Bloomington where the demand was greatest. If you want a hint, take the corner of Kirkwood and Dunn. If we could have been charging $2 an hour and there would still have been a demand for that parking. So, this plan codifies and formalizes the idea that, yes, we should be thinking about demand, not just supply. There are solutions we can implement immediately too. We've heard people talk about parking cash out. That's a pretty straightforward one. There's a neighborhood in my district that is already ready to try the idea of a parking benefit district, where we allow neighbors to keep paying the same nominal amount per year, say $45 a year for their permit, but excess supply in that neighborhood can be sold to non-residents at a premium. That would be entirely decided by the neighborhood. And every dollar above that first 45 would go into a fund that would fix infrastructure in that neighborhood, build curbs, add lighting, bury power cables, and the like. They're very excited to try it. We could be, we could set a range of meter rates so that the meters can be adjusted every year or every quarter based on demand. And it could be adjusted by it doesn't require an ordinance. These are things we could do right now to manage demand. And this plan, I believe, gives us the foundation for exploring those ideas. We've come a long way since the year before meters. In 2012, we had a special committee on street design and engineering standards, and the city's engineering manager at the time could not answer council members' questions as to what the definition of induced demand was. And now, not only can our staff do that, we have an entire plan that contemplates that idea. Since that time, wisely, I think the administration merged the planning for transportation into the planning department. And we've called the department Planning and Transportation. It was a very important move that recognizes that transportation is as important to the cost of living locally as housing is. And that how you get around is as important as where you can afford to live. So being able to properly price demand for transportation will enable us to provide better supply and to manage the demand. I can't say enough good things about this this plan. I want to thank Beth Rosenbarger and Terry Porter from Planning and Transportation. I am wholeheartedly in support of this plan, and I'm looking forward to beginning to explore how we could implement it. And I would urge everyone not to be afraid of how to fund it. That I think that as we begin implementing the strategies in it, it will fund itself. With that, if there's no other comment, I will ask the clerk to call the roll on Resolution 2008. Please turn on your microphones.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Flaherty,
Yes.
Smith,
No.
Sandberg,
Yes.
Rallo,
Yes.
Scambalori,
Yes.
Rosenbarger,
Yes.
Sims,
Yes.
and Volly.
Yes. With an 8-1 vote, Resolution 2008 is adopted. Thank you again to Planning and Transportation staff for the presentation. We will now move on to the next item on our agenda, which I have misplaced.
Additional public comment.
We're going to first reading resolutions, but we have none, so we'll go to additional public comment. Is there any member of the public who would like to address the council on an item that is not on the agenda, who has not already spoken? If so, please use the raise hand function in Zoom, or if you like, type into the chat box, also in Zoom. Mr. Lucas, do we have any takers for additional public comment? You're muted.
I've muted myself. I don't see any commenters, and I don't see that we received any written comments from the previous public commenter on the resolution.
I'm sorry about that. Okay, we go now to matters of council schedule. I know we have just now created a special session for next week. Is there a work session on Friday?
We have no more scheduled work sessions between now and council recess. You did mention the special session. While the president is authorized to schedule those meetings, now might be a good time, if that's the will of the council, to just go ahead and make that a formal motion. The only other item is just a reminder that the PS Lit committee process is kicking off tomorrow with that committee's first meeting at noon. But that's the only reminder. So if the council wanted to schedule a special session next week, it could do so now.
I move that we schedule a special session.
Is there a member who'd like to?
For Wednesday, June 10th.
Motion and a second? Yes, okay. These delays are killing me. All right. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, can we have a roll call vote on the motion for a special session on June the 10th?
Yes, Councilmember Flaherty?
Yes.
Smith?
Yes.
Sandberg?
Yes.
Rallo?
Yes.
Scamillori?
Yes.
Rosenbarger?
Yes.
Sims?
Yes.
Boland?
Yes.
And Piedmont Smith?
Yes.
All right, so we will have a special session next Wednesday. I also want to remind the Sustainable Development Committee that there is a resolution coming your way that we will take up next week immediately after the special session. So I'm expecting it will be 6:45, give or take, but it'll be no earlier than 6:45. So with that, if there are no other announcements or questions, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So moved. Second.
Motion is second. I'm not going to bother with a roll call vote. All in favor, please say aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you all and good night.